Every murder tells two stories. One is written in crime scenes and evidence. The other lives in the mind, where resentment grows, and one moment can change everything. I'm Kelsey Coffey, and this is the Powell Explosion, the Powell family tragedy. Before we begin, a content warning. This episode contains discussions of intimate partner homicide, missing persons, child homicide, domestic abuse, coercive control, and suicide. There are also references to stalking-like behaviors, voyeurism, and the possession of child sexual abuse material. Listener discretion is strongly advised. On a cold Sunday afternoon in early February 2012, a state-contracted social worker pulled up outside a single-story rental home on a cul-de-sac near Graham, Washington, with two little boys in her car, 7-year-old Charlie Powell and 5-year-old Braden Powell. These supervised visits with their father, Josh Powell, had become a painful compromise after months of legal wrangling over custody, background checks, and disturbing discoveries in the Powell extended family. Charlie and Braden walked ahead toward the front door, small backpacks bouncing, while the social worker followed just a few steps behind, paperwork in hand, prepared to do what she had done many times before: observe, document, and then return the boys to the safety of their maternal grandparents' home. Josh opened the door, ushered his sons inside, and then, in a move that would later haunt investigators, he slammed the door shut and locked it before the social worker could enter. On the porch, she could hear the boys inside, and she immediately sensed something was very wrong. She pounded on the door, called her supervisor, and dialed 911, trying to explain that this was not just a parent being difficult, it was a parent with a documented connection to an unresolved missing persons case, and a long trail of red flags. Within minutes, the smell of gasoline filled the air, and a massive explosion ripped through the home, sending flames and debris skyward. As neighbors called 911 and first responders rushed toward a scene that they would soon describe as one of the most horrifying in their careers. The man in that house was not just a father in a custody dispute. He was also the primary person of interest in the 2009 disappearance of his wife, Susan Cox Powell, a 28-year-old mother from West Valley City, Utah, who vanished on a snowy December night and has never been found. This is the Powell family case. 2. The disappearance of Susan, the murder of her children, Charlie and Braden, and the murder-suicide carried out by their father, Josh. At its core, the mystery that still haunts investigators and Susan's family is not only what exactly happened to Susan on or around December 6th through the 7th of 2009, but how so many warning signs could be documented in files and courtrooms and yet fail to keep two little boys safe. In the Powell family case, we're dealing with a story that spans multiple states, years of escalating control and conflict, and a justice system that always seemed to be one step behind a man determined to keep control at all costs. How did a seemingly ordinary family living in a Utah suburb, Susan, Josh, and their two sons, move from financial stress and marital tension into a spiral of coercive control, isolation, disappearance, and ultimately a triple homicide? In order to find out, we'll trace Josh's behavior patterns, Susan's documented fears and attempts to protect herself, the role of Josh's father, Steve Powell, and the decisions made by law enforcement, child welfare, and the courts. We'll look at the forensic and digital breadcrumbs, the custody hearings, and the psychosexual evaluation that was ordered just days before the explosion. And most of all, we'll keep returning to Susan, Charlie, and Braden, their lives, their relationships, and the systemic gaps that failed to keep them safe. To understand the Powell family tragedy, you must start with Susan Cox, born Susan Marie Cox, a young woman described by friends and family as outgoing, nurturing, and deeply rooted to her faith as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. By the time she was 19, Susan was working, attending church activities, and starting a life that blended family, faith, and hope for stability. The kind of stability that stood in contrast to some of the chaotic dynamics she would later face after marrying Josh Powell. She loved crafts, cooking, and spending time with her two sons, Charlie and Braden. And those who knew her say she was devoted to being a present, engaged mother who poured her energy into their daily routines. In photos and videos shared by relatives and news outlets, Susan appears smiling and playful with her 2 boys, the kind of mom who seemed to find joy in ordinary moments like trips to the park and church events. By late 2009, the Powells were living in West Valley City, a suburb of Salt Lake City, Utah, in a modest home that reflected both the strain and hope of a young family trying to find their footing in a tough economy. The neighborhood was a typical suburban mix of families, many of them connected through local LDS wards, with kids playing outside, carpools to church and school, and a culture that emphasized community and mutual support. For Susan, that community mattered. She attended church regularly with Charlie and Braden, and she tried to build a faith-centered home even as financial pressures and marital conflict with Josh intensified. Her extended family, the Coxes, lived in Washington state but remained closely involved, visiting, talking often, and becoming a safety net she increasingly turned to when tensions at home grew. Susan met Josh in the early 2000s in Washington state, and their relationship moved quickly toward marriage in 2001, a decision that at the time seemed aligned with the expectations in their religious and social circles. Friends and relatives have since described early glimpses of controlling tendencies in Josh, concerns about finances, decision-making, and his need to be in charge that would later come into full focus. But at the time, those comments lived mostly in private conversations and in personal writing. Susan did what many young spouses do. She tried to make it work. She tried to build a life with Josh in the places his job and preferences took them, and tried to reconcile the person she thought she had married with the man he increasingly revealed himself to be. By 2007 and 2008, with Charlie and then Braden born, Susan's identity as a mother became central to her daily life and sense of purpose. She worked outside the home at times, including in customer service roles. But she also shouldered the bulk of childcare and household responsibilities, often budgeting carefully to make ends meet. Friends later told reporters that Susan was the one clipping coupons, managing meals, and trying to keep the family afloat while Josh made financial decisions that sometimes increased their debt, including risky spending and unstable employment. Through it all, Susan's social media posts and personal writings reflected a woman who loved her children deeply and was trying to hold on to her sense of self in a marriage that felt increasingly lopsided. In June 2008, Susan took a step that reveals just how aware she was of the potential danger she faced. She wrote a letter, later described by investigators and the media, warning that if she were to die, it might not be an accident. In that letter, which she kept in a safety deposit box only she could access, she referenced threats from Josh and said he told her he could destroy her if she pursued divorce, a chilling articulation of a dynamic that advocates now recognize as classic coercive control. This was not a dramatic flourish or a journal entry written in a moment of passing anger. It was a deliberate, documented act of self-protection, a record she hoped would speak for her if she could not speak for herself. Around that same time, subtle but significant fault lines in the Powell marriage were becoming more visible to those around them. Disputes about money, religion, and Josh's reluctance to fully participate in the LDS faith that was so important to Susan. There were concerns about Josh's temper, about his tendency to isolate Susan, and about the influence of his father, Steve, whose own obsession with Susan and later criminal charges for voyeurism and child pornography would shock even seasoned investigators. Yet despite those red flags, Susan remained committed to her children and trying to create a loving home, walking that tightrope so many victims of coercive control walk when trying to keep the peace, while quietly documenting the danger. As we move forward, that tension between the life Susan was building and the control Josh was determined to maintain will become the fault line on which everything else breaks. When you zoom in on the relationship between Susan and Josh, what emerges is a pattern of financial control, emotional manipulation, and escalating conflict that is striking both in its specificity and in how familiar it looks to those who study domestic abuse. Josh had a history of unstable employment and significant debt, including a prior bankruptcy before the marriage. And during the marriage, he often resisted Susan's efforts to rein in spending and pursue more conservative financial choices. That imbalance meant Susan was often the one scrambling over the basic expenses, including groceries and the mortgage, while Josh made big decisions without meaningful contribution. Financial stress can strain any relationship, but in the Powell's home, it became one more tool in a larger pattern of control. Spiritually, the couple was increasingly out of sync. Susan was active in the LDS church, attended services, and wanted a faith-centered home for Charlie and Braden, while Josh, who had been raised in a conflicted religious environment, drifted away from the church involvement and sometimes clashed with Susan over religious practices and expectations. Friends later described tension around tithing, church attendance, and Susan's desire for community engagement that Josh didn't always share. That divide left Susan feeling isolated at times and also meant she could not fully rely on shared religious values with her spouse to mediate conflict or provide a common framework for decision-making. Layered into this already fragile dynamic was the presence of Josh's father, Steve Powell, whose behavior towards Susan went far beyond ordinary in-law tension. Steve developed what he himself later referred to in media interviews as an intense romantic obsession with Susan, claiming she reciprocated feelings, claims that Susan's family and investigators adamantly rejected. In 2011, Washington authorities searching Steve's home seized explicit images, voyeuristic recordings, and other evidence that led to charges of voyeurism and possession of child pornography, including material involving neighborhood children. The discovery of that material did not just lead to Steve's arrest. It triggered a re-examination of the environment in which Charlie and Braden were being raised, and fed into the child welfare case that would later move them to their maternal grandparents' home. From the outside, some of the early warning signs appeared in fleeting comments from Charlie, in Susan's letter and journal entries, and in the concerns her friends tried to raise. After Susan's disappearance, one account detailed by investigators described young Charlie mentioning that Mommy was in the mine and that she had gone on a camping trip but hadn't come back. Statements difficult to interpret from a small child, but yet deeply unsettling in context. Meanwhile, Susan's June 2008 letter and her remarks to coworkers and friends painted a picture of a woman who feared that Josh might do something to her if she tried to leave, including explicit references to threats to ruin her or make her disappear. These pieces, scattered across different people and systems, formed a mosaic of risk that would only be fully appreciated in hindsight. Motive in the Powell case cannot be reduced to a single line, but legal filings and investigative reporting point to a combination of financial strain, fear of losing control in the marriage, and Josh's deeply entrenched need to dominate his environment. In the months before Susan vanished, there were discussions about divorce, of changes to the life insurance policy, and of Susan asserting more independence, including considering leaving the marriage if Josh didn't change. When you layer that onto an already controlling dynamic, you get a classic high-risk period. The time when a partner begins to separate or threatens to separate is statistically one of the most dangerous times in an abusive relationship. Josh's actions after Susan's disappearance, abruptly moving from Utah to Washington with the boys, refusing to cooperate with police beyond minimal questioning, and tightly managing the narrative around Susan, fit a pattern of someone more focused on self-protection than on finding a missing spouse. Over the next 2 years, as the investigation into Susan's disappearance continued and Washington authorities uncovered Steve Powell's crimes, the pressure on Josh mounted. He lost his father's home as a base, lost full custody of his sons, and faced a court-ordered psychosexual evaluation. Instead of engaging in those processes, Josh would orchestrate a final act of control that weaponized not just his own life, but the lives of Charlie and Braden, as leverage against a world he felt was closing in. To trace how this case exploded, literally and figuratively, you have to step back to December 6th and 7th, 2009, in West Valley City, Utah. On Sunday, December 6th, Susan attended church with Charlie and Braden at their local LDS ward, and then house where Susan was reportedly tired and not feeling well. That evening, according to Josh's later statements, he decided to take the boys on a late-night camping trip in the middle of a snowstorm, leaving Susan allegedly asleep at home. This account struck investigators and family as implausible from the beginning. Who takes two very young children camping after midnight in freezing conditions with no clear destination and limited supplies? On the morning of Monday, December 7th, concerned coworkers reported that Susan had not shown up for work and that her children were absent from daycare. West Valley City Police went to the Powell home and found no one was answering the door. Eventually forced entry, discovering Susan's purse, wallet, and keys inside, along with two fans blowing on a wet couch where a dark spot suggested recently cleaned fabric. There was no sign of Susan, and nothing indicated she had left voluntarily. Her car was in the driveway, and there were no known plans for travel or a break from work and childcare duties. Later that day, Josh returned home with the boys and was quickly taken to the police station for questioning. He told officers he had gone camping at Simpson Springs in Utah's West Desert, leaving around midnight and returning late in the afternoon, claiming he had forgotten all about the workday and childcare schedules. Investigators found his explanations about the timing, the weather, and Susan's supposed sleep at home to be inconsistent with common sense and with what they knew about Susan's habits and responsibilities. Early theories considered possibilities ranging from an accident to voluntary disappearance, but suspicion quickly turned to foul play centered on Josh. As the days turned into weeks, West Valley police pursued multiple leads. They searched the Simpson Springs area, tracked Josh's movements through cell phone records and vehicle GPS, and canvassed neighbors for anything unusual around the time Susan went missing. They also learned of Susan's 2008 warning letter and her statements about fear of Josh, adding a chilling context to her disappearance. Despite intensive effort, no physical remains or definitive crime scene linked to Susan were recovered, leaving investigators with a strongly suspected victim and a likely suspect, but no body and no formal charges. In 2010 and 2011, as the missing persons case remained open, the Powell family's geographic center shifted from Utah to Washington. Josh moved with Charlie and Braden to Washington, living first with his father Steve, whose home would later become the focus of a separate criminal case when authorities executed a search warrant related to Susan's case and uncovered voyeuristic and child pornography materials. This search and Steve's subsequent arrest in September 2011 triggered child welfare concerns about the environment in which Charlie and Braden were being raised, resulting in the boys being placed with Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, while Josh was granted supervised visitation. In early February 2012, the stage was set for a tragic convergence of long-running investigations and immediate child welfare decisions. A Washington judge had recently ordered Josh to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, including a polygraph, as part of the custody case, and child welfare officials were seeking more information about materials linked to the Powell home. Josh knew his access to Charlie and Braden was under scrutiny and that the court could move to further restrict his contact if the evaluation or new evidence suggested additional risk. On February 5, 2012, during what should have been a routine supervised visit near Graham, Washington, those accumulated tensions erupted into an explosion that not only killed Josh and his sons, but forced the entire system to confront the unsettling question of how warning signs have been interpreted and missed. Two law enforcement jurisdictions anchor this story. West Valley City Police Department in Utah, which investigated Susan's December 2009 disappearance, and the authorities in Washington state, including the Pierce County Sheriff's Department and local agencies, which responded to the 2012 explosion and oversaw related child welfare inquiries. From the outset, Valley detectives treated the Powell home as a potential crime scene, seizing computers, reviewing cell phone records, and noting anomalies like the wet couch and missing bed sheets. Search warrants extended to vehicles and electronic devices, allowing investigators to reconstruct some of Josh's movements and communications in the hours and days surrounding Susan's disappearance. Digital forensics played a significant role, particularly in Utah, where cell phone tower pings and call logs helped investigators evaluate Josh's story about his late-night camping trip and his whereabouts when Susan was last seen. The data did not provide a full blueprint of his movements, but it raised questions about the plausibility of his claimed timeline and highlighted gaps that he did not credibly explain in interviews. In later years, law enforcement also pursued searches in remote areas of Utah and Nevada, including mine shafts near Ely, based on potential leads and theories about where Susan's body might have been concealed. But these efforts did not locate her remains. Back in Washington, the August 2011 search of Steve Powell's home, executed in connection with the Utah investigation, opened an unexpected window into the Powell family's hidden life. Detectives seized journals, computer hard drives, and digital media, uncovering voyeuristic materials and child sexual abuse images that led to Steve's arrest on multiple counts of voyeurism and possession of child pornography. Although those charges were legally separate from Susan's disappearance, they confirmed that Charlie and Braden had been living in a highly unsafe environment and directly influenced Washington's decision to remove the boys from Josh's custody and place them with their maternal grandparents. The forensic picture of the February 2012 explosion came together quickly. Investigators determined that Josh had brought in at least 2 5-gallon gasoline cans and used accelerant throughout the house, setting a fast-moving fire that originated near the center of the home where he and his boys' bodies were later found. Autopsies showed that Charlie and Braden died primarily from carbon monoxide poisoning, but also had significant chopping injuries to the head and neck, and a hatchet was recovered near Josh's body, leading authorities to conclude he attacked the boys before the fire overtook them. Emails sent by Josh to relatives, his attorney, and others shortly before the explosion detailed instructions about his assets and affairs and included an explicit statement that he could not live without his sons, clearly indicating premeditation. When you compare Josh's long-standing statements about being a loving, unfairly targeted father with the physical and digital evidence from the explosion, the contradiction is stark. A man who insisted he just wanted to parent his boys safely planned an event that required acquiring gasoline, arranging the interior of his home, sending farewell emails, and exploiting a supervised visitation to ensure he had time alone with Charlie and Braden. Investigators and prosecutors in Washington characterized the explosion and killings as clearly intentional, with one sheriff bluntly referring to it as the murder of 2 young children and likely a de facto confession to whatever happened to Susan. The investigative breakthrough in this case was not a moment that solved Susan's disappearance. That remains officially unresolved. But the combination of Utah's long-term missing persons inquiry, the Washington state search of Steve Powell's home, and the forensic reconstruction of the February 2012 explosion. Together, these strands painted a coherent narrative: a controlling husband, a wife who documented her fear, an extended family environment rife with sexual boundary violations, and a final act of murder-suicide that matched the worst-case scenario advocates had warned about. At that point, attention necessarily shifted from building a prosecutable homicide case against Josh, no longer possible, to examining the systems that had intersected with this family, and to the civil and administrative processes that would follow. Because Susan's disappearance never resulted in criminal charges against Josh during his lifetime, the classic criminal trial arc you might expect in a homicide case never fully materialized on that front. Instead, courtroom proceedings centered on 2 parallel tracks: the Washington criminal prosecution of Steve Powell for voyeurism and child pornography, and the family court and dependency court battles over custody and safety planning for Charlie and Braden. For Susan's disappearance, West Valley City authorities publicly stated that Josh was a person of interest and that they believed they were dealing with a homicide. But no formal murder charges were filed before his death. In the Washington criminal case against Steve Powell, prosecutors charged him with multiple counts of voyeurism and possession of child pornography after investigators recovered explicit images and recordings taken without consent, including images of neighborhood children. The prosecution's theory was straightforward. Steve had secretly recorded and collected sexualized images demonstrating both criminal behavior and a deeply unsafe environment for any children living in his home. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the search and characterization of certain images, but a jury ultimately convicted Steve on several counts, leading to a prison sentence that underscored the seriousness of his conduct. In the family court realm, the focus was on the best interests and safety of Charlie and Braden. After Steve's arrest and the revelation of the material seized from his home, Washington's Child Welfare Agency moved to remove the boys from Josh's care, citing concerns about their living environment and unresolved questions about Susan's disappearance. The boys were placed temporarily with their maternal grandparents, the Coxes, while Josh was granted supervised visitation under strict conditions. During these dependency proceedings, one key decision point came when a judge ordered Josh to undergo a psychosexual evaluation, including a polygraph, as part of determining whether he could safely regain custody or unsupervised contact with his sons. The state's position was that, given the voyeurism and child pornography evidence in the extended family and the unresolved suspicion around Susan's disappearance, such an evaluation was necessary to fully assess risk. Josh's legal team continued to argue that he was being unfairly punished for his father's crimes, and that there was no direct evidence he had harmed his children, framing the state's concerns as speculation. There was never a criminal trial for the murder of Charlie and Braden because Josh died in the same explosion that killed them, and authorities quickly classified the deaths as a murder-suicide. Pierce County officials and other Washington authorities publicly stated that the evidence, fuel cans, accelerant patterns, emails, and the locked door scenario with the social worker outside demonstrated premeditated homicide. Without a surviving defendant, there were no charges to file, but the investigative findings functioned as a de facto public case, shaping how the community and Susan's family understood what had happened. In the aftermath, civil litigation also became part of the legal landscape. Susan's parents filed claims against Washington state agencies, arguing that child welfare and court-supervised visitation decisions had failed to adequately protect Charlie and Braden, despite numerous warning signs. Reviews and reports commissioned after the murders examined the timeline of caseworker actions, court hearings, and information sharing between agencies, critiquing delays and missed opportunities to fully account for risk. Those proceedings did not bring Susan, Charlie, or Braden back, but they forced institutions to publicly reckon with the consequences of their decisions and consider reforms. In the years since the explosion in Graham, Washington, Susan's family has to carry a triple grief: the unresolved loss of Susan, the confirmed murders of Charlie and Braden, and the knowledge that the system meant to protect them did not act in time. They have continued to speak publicly about Susan, sharing memories of her as a loving daughter, sister, and mother, and they are vocal about the boys' personalities, their playfulness, their affection, the way they had started to slowly heal in their grandparents' home before their deaths. Keeping Susan's name in the public conversation is not just about seeking formal closure in a legal sense. It is about refusing to let her story fade into the background of a case often overshadowed by Josh's final act. Memorials for Charlie and Braden have taken physical and symbolic forms. The boys were buried at Woodbine Cemetery in Washington, where a memorial for Susan sits as well, creating a shared space for remembering the family as a unit rather than as fragments of separate tragedies. Community vigils, anniversary gatherings, and online remembrance campaigns have kept their memories visible and provided a place for collective mourning, especially around key dates like Susan's disappearance and the February 2012 explosion. These rituals serve not only the immediate family, but the broader community that followed the case and felt the shock of realizing this has happened. One of the most painful parts of the aftermath has been reviewing the record of warning signs and missed opportunities. Susan's 2008 letter, her documented fears about Josh, the escalating concerns around Steve Powell's voyeurism and child pornography, the boy's statements after her disappearance, and the long-running status of Josh as a person of interest all painted a picture of high risk that, in retrospect, seems unmistakable. Official reviews and reports have acknowledged delays in communicating critical information, debates over the weight of circumstantial evidence, and the challenges of acting decisively when a suspect has not been criminally charged. None of this is about assigning simple blame. It is about understanding how, in a complex system, risk signals can be recognized but still not fully integrated into life or death decisions. If you hear echoes of your own situation or someone you care about in Susan's story, you know that resources exist even when the path feels impossibly tangled. National and local domestic violence hotlines, crisis centers, and legal aid organizations can help with safety planning, housing, and navigating protective orders. Many have confidential chat and text options if calling feels unsafe. Friends, coworkers, and faith leaders can play a role too, not by trying to fix everything, but by believing disclosures, helping document concerns, and connecting victims with specialized support. No one case can tell you exactly what to do, but cases like this remind us that taking threats, coercion, and isolation seriously is not overreacting. It is survival work. As I sit with the story of Susan, Charlie, and Braden, I keep coming back to the contrast between the ordinary and catastrophic church services, the suburban routines, the kids' supervised visits existing alongside secret letters, sealed court files, and ultimately an explosion that ended 3 lives. The Powell family case is heavy, not because of its twists, but because of how many points along the way someone tried to raise a hand and say, something is wrong here. Remembering them means honoring those voices, pushing our systems to do better, and believing people the first time when they say they're afraid. What you have just heard is more than just a crime story. It's a glaring reminder of how quickly emotions can turn fatal, and how often warning signs go unseen. Until next time, I'm Kelsey Coffey reminding you to lock your doors, bolt your windows, and beware the dangers hiding in plain sight.